the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 23rd chapter, verses 1 through 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their paracletes broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets, the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." A couple of Christmases back, one of my boys gifted me a little book entitled, actually this is not the exact title of it because I have to change the word since I'm saying it here in church. You guys can figure out which word it is. The book's entitled "Stuff My Daddy Said." You can figure out what word is all in here. It's full of sayings that I've actually heard over my lifetime and over the years that I've been around and remember my parents. If you have to pick that book up and start reading it, it'd make you smile, because I'm sure the sayings in there are sayings that you've heard from your parents or from teachers or the leaders in the past. Now, as a teenager, I amassed a whole list of things that my parents said that I swore I would never say. Anybody else in that situation? Huh? You know things like, "You're not leaving the house dressed like that," or "Wipe that look off your face," or "Just wait till your father gets home." Huh? At the top of that list was one that reeked of that sort of adult hypocrisy that teens just love to snatch onto. I can't recall the exact occasion, but sometime during my teenage years, my behavior elicited these words, and I can still hear my mother's voice ringing in my ears with that deep accent proclaiming, "Don't do as I say, do as I do." Or, I'm sorry, "Don't do as I do as I say." Don't do as I do as I say. I mean, no teenager, egocentric as they are, idealistic as teenagers can be, want to hear that. Don't do as I do as I say. All these years later, I can still feel that sense of indignation, my outrage at the notion that my mother wanted me to do something and had this standard of behavior that she couldn't live up to herself. I mean, that's what that means, right? I want you to do something that I can't really live up to myself. Of course, what goes around comes around. Now, I'm a parent myself, and I've heard myself say some of the very things that I vowed I'd never repeat. Anybody else in that boat? And I find that as I understand so much better the frustrations that my mother and my father had, and how they must have felt not just frustrations, but the desires and hopes that they had for me, that she wanted her children to become something more than what she had been, more than what my parents had been. They wanted us to excel and be good people and do good things. Of course, as a teen, you don't get that. And I know all too well the truth that she hit upon when she pronounced that what she said I should not do what she did. The truth that it's awfully hard to live up to ideals of others it's hard to really practice what we preach. It's easy for all of us to say things. It's all easy for all of us to ask others to do things, but it's not always so hard to do ourselves. And we ask of our children, we ask of our friends, we ask of our co-workers, and oftentimes we can't live up to those things that we ask others to do. It's not because that we think we're better than them, they should be doing it. It's because we have high hopes and high ideals for them that we want them to do it. And for one reason or another in our life's journey, we have either been unable to or unwilling to do this. We hear that truth running through Jesus' tirade this morning in the Gospel according to Matthew against the scribes and Pharisees. It's really the centerpiece of this Gospel reading. It says, the scribes and Pharisees sat on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. Jesus tells his followers, and then he goes on to enumerate the many behaviors that belie this teaching. Now, it's not that Jesus is calling out the scribes and Pharisees for hypocrisy, because he's really not doing that. What he's really doing is not ragging on the Pharisees and scribes, because they are not inherently evil. It's not because the Jewish law didn't matter anymore, because indeed it did. Jesus even reminded his followers more than once that the law needs to still be followed. But the reason Jesus singled out the Pharisees and scribes is because in all of their humanness, they provided rich fodder for telling this story, because they were repeatedly falling so short of what they preached. I wonder if Jesus were back here today, whether he might afford some equal fodder for us folks who call ourselves Christians. That we preach about love and hope and nurture and care and peace, but that we always practice it? Or do we fall short? We are members of churches who have actually a pretty deep liturgical tradition and perhaps can identify with the Pharisees to some extent, because once it gets a little bit colder, as you know, I'll be wearing a robe and I'll have my stole on and my vestments, and we have titles. I'm the Reverend and soon to be Doctor. And I know that there are a bunch of disciple ministers who are friends of mine who drool over catalogs that come in when they have their vestments, or if they're gifted a new stole, like this congregation vested me, that, you know, the merits of having that are something high. It's not that they're centered upon that so much, being called preacher, pastor, reverend, or whatever name it is. It's just part of our role. And so we can identify with those Pharisees. But I think people in the church can too, because you guys are here on Sunday morning. Some of you still dress really nice. Your minister doesn't so much, but some folks still come to church really dressed nice, but they don't dress like that every day of the week because it's something special for them. It's a sort of robe investment that they come on this Sunday to do that. And I was talking with Toby before the service, because we have a leak in our baptismal, which allowed us not to immerse Samantha. So we did it in a method other than what we normally do. By the way, it's an issue we have to look at, because in the disciples' tradition, we have two sacraments, communion and baptism. And so we can't really do away with it. So that's another issue, but that's something we have to take care of and take care of that. But because of those things, we all are part of that all the time. You know, communion is really important to us. So we fit in with those Pharisees and those scribes. We too talk a good talk. You know, tell others from outside our church, or talk among ourselves about what other people should be doing, and then sometimes we don't do the same thing. And sometimes we actually do the opposite of what we're telling people to do and what they should do. were not so different from those scribes and Pharisees. Of course, the problem really goes much deeper than what we wear, or whether or not we baptize by immersion, or whether I wear a stole, or whether I'm called pastor or preacher, or whether you're called elder or deacon, or whether you're called a Christian. Those are perspectives. Jesus' concern then, and Jesus' concern now, is the way those things get out of perspective. The way our motivations for doing them become distorted, so they end up as an end in themselves. Let me say that again. How they end up being an end in themselves. The way they become a substitute for what they are really about. What they are really about is glorifying God and living as disciples. When Samantha was baptized this morning, well, I'm glad that I was here to witness that, and I celebrate that day with her. It's not about Samantha, it's about God. It's still about the fact that we're glorifying God and saying, God, I invite you into my life. Now teach me how to be a disciple of your Son. If human nature made it hard for the scribes and Pharisees to keep their motives pure, to practice what they preach, we here in the 21st century are even more disadvantaged. We still have the same human nature that those Pharisees and scribes had. And we're still embedded in a culture that values appearance, status, wealth, position, individualism, materialism, and consumerism. Coupled with the fact that the role of church in society is greatly diminished, it's no wonder that our tendency to do things to make ourselves stand out as individuals and as an institution can make us forget why we're Christians. It can lead us away from the kind of discipleship that Jesus is calling us to. Sometimes we become too focused upon those things that are just an echo, a vision, something that points to the greater thing, and make that become the thing. Because discipleship has nothing to do with standing out, being self-serving or putting yourself first. In fact, quite the contrary. We, all of us, are called not to be served, but to serve others. As we hear in the gospel this morning, according to St. Matthew, Jesus consistently reminded his followers that the greatest among you is to be a servant. And those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted. And so we find ourselves caught between the gospel and what the gospel calls us to live out, and a culture that upholds, and that we often find ourselves in the same bind the Pharisees and scribes found themselves ensnared in. The things that my mother told me about and understood so well. Don't do as I do as I say. We believe one thing, we hold it dear in our heart, and yet our behavior makes what we say an absolute lie. I see it in myself, and I see it in folks in my congregations that I've served. I see it in friends. Don't do as I do as I say. If you think I'm being too hard on myself and on you, on all those who are calling themselves Christians, think about what lives as average churchgoers are like. You come to church on Sunday morning for an hour or two, you hear the good news, you're moved by my sermon and maybe the hymns, and as I'm standing out in the hallway, you come to me and say, boy, I really need to hear that. That was a great sermon. And you might have been so moved, even you throw a few extra bucks in the collection plate for outreach, and you say, I'm going to work in a food pantry, or I'm going to bring in a sack of groceries. And you feel refreshed, and you go out to MCL, feeling a little bit self-satisfied, But when you're honest with yourself, you think, I've been to church, and that's where it ended. Because 9 times out of 10, once we leave this edifice, we leave our discipleship behind us. We don't leave it behind on purpose, of course. We don't walk away from here saying, I feel good about all that, I hear all that stuff, I'm not going to do it, but it's great to hear it. We really have those intentions. It's just hard for us to connect with that really important saying of Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. With the news of illegal immigrants who are picked up while harvesting our crop, or a homeless man sitting on the street hoping to get enough change to buy a hamburger at McDonald's, it's hard to connect. It's hard to connect with Jesus' command to turn the other cheek when we hear congressional requests for more defense spending and reports of violence around the world. It's hard to heed Jesus' injunctions to not worry about what you shall eat or drink or what you shall wear when the economy has plummeted southward. It's hard to live up to our ideals that we think about. Paul says in the letter to Romans, we do things we hate, and we fail to do things we want to do. We don't practice what we preach, is what Paul was saying. The same thing that Jesus said in this sermon this morning. Frankly, there's only one answer to this dilemma. For the dilemma that ails us. Because we all ail this dilemma. We all have this sickness. And the answer to that dilemma is God's grace. God's grace for us means that no matter how many times we walk out of church, leaving our discipleship behind us, God will give us another opportunity to live fully into the good news of God's kingdom. No matter how often we act in self-serving ways, we will be given more chances to serve other people. No matter how badly we fail to live out our discipleship, to practice what we preach, God's love and grace are still there for us. They still hold on to us, bring us comfort, and sustain us. We always have one more chance. One more chance to get it right. To embrace Jesus' call to be servants, to see our neighbors at every turn in life, whoever they may be, to see them, to love them, and unselfishly, unreservedly love them. That's what Jesus teaches us over and over and over again. And Jesus never fails to practice. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Praise be to God.